Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the concept of avoiding confirmation bias by remaining curious. We're going to talk about a few strategies to help you avoid confirmation bias and keep yourself in a good problem-solving frame of mind, in a good conversation and inviting dialogue communication strategies. So let's first talk about what confirmation bias is. Confirmation bias is the tendency that basically all of us as human beings have to seek data that confirms our pre-existing state of mind or decisions or observations, and to not only ignore, but actually actively ignore any data or information or perspective that challenges our decisions or perspectives or opinions. Let's think about what that says in terms of leadership communication. The idea here is talk like a leader. So we're going to focus on the communication implications of confirmation bias primarily. And I'll acknowledge that there are two competing issues that are happening for pretty much all leaders. One is the need to be decisive, to come to a conclusion, to make a decision, point a direction, initiate action for your team. That is an important thing for leaders to do. It's also important for leaders to gather data and fairly consider alternative viewpoints and take input from multiple sources to make sure they're fairly considering all sides of an issue. So it's important to both be decisive and to gather data. Now, these are inherently contradictory ideas because deciding means you make a decision and just move on, and gathering data means you hold off on making a decision. These are competing ideas. And like so many things in leadership, balance is really the key. We want to decide fast enough to not miss opportunities or to not solve a problem, and slow enough to make sure we've considered everything fairly. It kind of reminds me of a line from a Jimmy Buffett song that says, you want to go fast enough to get there and slow enough to see. That's sort of the idea here. We want to decide fast enough to reach a decision and slow enough to consider everything we need to consider fairly. The danger is that as a leader, we can be quick to decide because we need to decide. And then we trick ourselves into believing that we're gathering data when really all we're doing is gathering data that already confirms the decision we've made. We look for justifying data. The important thing here is that we're all prone to this. This is a human nature statement. I am prone to it. My friends and coworkers are prone to it. You are prone to it. I don't really talk about confirmation bias in a judging or critical way, really more of an observational way. And I'm basically saying, hey, this is something we have to be careful of because it will affect your leadership communication in a number of ways that can have some really negative implications. One thing could be that because you've already made up your mind, you will ignore inputs from people who offer alternative explanations or perspectives, or who maybe see challenges with the course of action you're proposing, or the decision you've reached, the direction you want to go, whatever the particular situation is. You might actively ignore inputs from people who offer alternative explanations or perspectives. Worse still, you might actually argue with them rather than try to consider the perspective they're offering. And when you do that, what will tend to happen is you'll gradually teach your team that you don't really want to hear conflicting inputs. They will eventually stop offering them to you. And as a result, you can trap yourself in an echo chamber of your own thoughts where you're not getting the information that allows you to challenge your perspectives or your decisions or your directions. And that can lead you in a direction of basically not leading a team, but shifting more into a kind of a dictatorial sort of way of communicating, teaching your team to shut down and not offer their perspective. There's some research that's called the spiral of silence. And while that's a sociological principle, it can happen in teams too. You can create silence in your team by not listening to their inputs, which is part of communication. How do we avoid it? Well, one thing you could do, and by the way, there is pretty significant literature development, chapters in books, sometimes whole books written about this issue of confirmation bias and how to avoid it. So I don't think I can cover everything about it in this one little 10-minute episode. I just really want to remind you of some ideas that maybe you've actually heard before and you've stopped using. I know I have to remind myself of these ideas all the time. So there are two things that I'll suggest that can help you avoid confirmation bias in your decision making and in your communication strategies with your team. One thing you can do is you can actually invite people to shoot holes in your ideas. You can ask them to argue the opposite point from yours. Basically, give them permission to look for problems with what you're proposing or the direction you want to go or the decision you're reaching so that you can fairly consider the opposite idea. And this is an application of the second idea, which is more broadly stated, to work to remain curious. Do everything you can to remain curious about outcomes rather than judgmental. The thing you want to think about is that this idea of confirmation bias and how to fix your leadership communication applies in so many areas that it's really every area of your leadership journey and your leadership communication approach. This idea of confirmation bias is true in your judgments of people, and I'll examine this a bit more in a separate episode. And as we talk about how the DISC model, if you're not careful, can actually feed confirmation bias and cause you to not fairly consider people's input, maybe discount them because you've put them in a box or labeled them. So it can affect your judgments of people. It can affect your judgment of projects. You can have a pet project or pet direction or goal that you want to achieve that even if it was valid at one time, may or may not be currently valid. Or maybe you're making your decision about projects you want to implement based on old information or old situations or old technology. And it's helpful to invite people to shoot holes in the projects you want to implement or to pursue in your quest to make your team better. Confirmation bias can affect your read of situations. You can, because of past situations, because of past experiences with people and projects and situations, you can reach a snap judgment based on the past that may or may not be true in the present. So confirmation bias is something to be actively on guard against. You want to remain as curious as possible for as long as possible so that when it does come time to decide, you can make sure you have fairly considered all the different sides of a project, all the different sides of a goal you're trying to set, all the different sides of a solution to a problem or your read of a situation, all the different sides of how to deal with the people on your team, how to interact with your team, how to resolve conflicts on your team. This idea of confirmation bias is a very significant issue, and I want to encourage you to work actively to avoid it. I don't know that any of us can be perfect at avoiding confirmation bias. It's part of human psychology. It's part of human nature, human tendency. What we can do is be aware of it and put processes and procedures and even policies in place to help us stay out of the trap. And some of the things you can do, like I said, are to invite people, give people permission to shoot holes in your ideas, maybe even institutionalize it, maybe have a procedure before you decide on how you're going to implement projects, to have a particular person take what's known as the devil's advocate position to actually argue against the idea. It doesn't mean they have to agree with what they're arguing so that you can actually stay calm and not get upset with people because you've asked them to argue the negative just to make sure you haven't missed anything. So for this week, I want to encourage you to avoid confirmation bias. Do everything you can to remain curious, gathering information, and considering all sides of an issue before you move forward. If you'll do this, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.